Greetings. Hello. Over the past semester, we have been analyzing the various stages of the Byzantine Empire, how it has grown and expanded to encompass the wider Mediterranean world, and how its territories have grown and shrunk all the way into the 14th century. The enslaved peoples that we've been looking at prior to today are in and around the Black Sea, also known as the Balkans, uh, that had been conquered earlier in previous phases of the Byzantine Empire, looking more towards Basil the First and Basil the Second, as it uh, lived and grew as an empire in the 11th century. So, however, as now we transition into a more organized nation that's more invested into the geopolitics of its age, the reliance on the constant influx of traders coming through the empire in order to enslave those within its borders and outside its borders is what becomes a source for the eventual downfall of the Byzantine Empire. And it is that enslavement that we have been looking at throughout this whole semester in regards to the development of the Byzantine Empire and, of course, the fall. Um, so, with the eventual cessation of the Mongols, or eventual cessation of the Mongol civil wars, and finally the unification of these Muslim sultanates, and the Byzantines' own creation of very powerful trade federations, such as the Genoan, such as the Venetian, and the Catalan um, trade federations. I can illustrate here. So we have Genoa, Venice, and Catalonia over here. Um, all of these traders eventually forced the Byzantine Empire to shrink, sell, and then eventually become overrun by a unified invading Muslim force, and then of course take Constantinople. But what we've been looking at previously is the extent of the empire under Justinian in the 6th century, all of this, the subsequent growth and then shrinkage in the 11th century, growth into Bulgaria and the Danube, and into Asia Minor, over to Trebizond in the 12th century. And now in the 14th century, we're going to be focusing on what is left of the empire. As you can see, all that is really left is small bits in Macedonia and then a couple bits here in Greece. I also feel the need to state that if my dogs start barking, please pay it no mind. But I should be in a quite enough space. So, uh, additionally, what has been the question of this class? And that's been what is Byzantine? We're trying to discover what was Byzantium. We're of course choosing to analyze this through the experience of those who had been enslaved by the empire. And I've been repeating throughout the semester that Byzantium was characterized by its claim of Roman heritage and continuation of the great Roman Empire, even with a shift of the empire from Rome to Constantinople. We've also been observing how people living in this empire constantly define their existence um, of themselves and as relative to that of the empire. And of course, in the later stages of the empire, that culture of empire and emperor relation will be used as a major wall against the cult and against the cultures of invading enemies. But we have here a wonderful quote by Mr. Stardate that I think sums up what we've been studying very nicely, that nationhood as a political claim and not as an ethno-cultural fact is what marked the difference between the national community as a phenomenon of modernity and the pre-modern ethnic group as a non-stable, non-coherent collectivity of notional common kinship and selected cultural markers that need not circumscribe its members' political loyalty. What is and is not political loyalty is all what has this is what has been this nailed it, um, this whole class. And we've been focusing on the ownership of these enslaved people, and how that is not limited to what these people thought of themselves or what was regarded simply as property, but all what they had as far as agency, what levels of agency these people had, and what influence that they could enact upon their surroundings. So, slaveholding in this period was primarily urban, artisanal, domestic, and as a result, most modern scholars have assumed it to be a gentler form of slavery. But what transpired between master and slave is really tied to the cultural signifiers to which each of these social groups is ascribed. And it's that social hierarchy that we're going to be looking at primarily today. So, additionally, throughout this lecture, because we're talking about some really depressing things like slavery and loss of agency and just not great things, I've decided to pepper in a bunch of random memes. So be prepared for those. And as well as, yeah, here we go. We got a nice little compound meme. A compound meme here as to what was Byzantine. What have we been studying previously? The Greeks and the Romans, this delineation of social hierarchy, making the fluidity of this Byzantine Empire as being neither Greek nor Roman, but Romaioi, is what allowed that Byzantine identity to flourish. But also, as they attempted to define themselves by who they were not, who was not allowed to be a part of these Romaioi. Of course, right over here we have the nice Slavic people. Even though they were around, they didn't just pop up into existence. They were not allowed to be a part of the culture, the Byzantine culture of the Romaioi. And this social equality is something that, of course, grows and allows the permissiality, allows it to be permissible for the eventual enslavement of these Slavic peoples. But that's, of course, not to say that these people who had been trafficked across the Mediterranean were without agency. We've actually studied plenty of examples of enslaved people violently resisting their masters that have been found in medieval court records in the 14th and 15th centuries. But the culture that we've been examining of those who had and those who had not is really exemplified in the ethnic culture, and attempting to transverse that social hierarchy, where of course we see issue, and as well as their self-imaging. So instead of being either solely Greek or solely Roman over here, a little bit, everybody was Byzantine, and they all defined themselves in relation to the Byzantine emperor. However, this service and honor to the emperor was tantamount to containing and reinforcing the social boundaries that were, of course, established. So, we also know that the debate between scholars as to whether or not the Byzantine economy can be analyzed within terms of modern macroeconomics, while the actuality of analysis of the Byzantine and Crusader state economies is a bit dubious. It is apparent that there was large amounts of wealth shared in and around the Byzantine nations through the Catalan, Venetian, and Genoese merchants. And of course, because I love The Office, this is an old Office picture of Michael Scott. with the Byzantine empires who just don't want to be enslaved themselves. They're just allowing these other merchants into their borders, and of course, allowing them to capture the Slavic pagans. But this existence of large foreigner hordes that reveal the wealth that this slave trade could generate goes through shows connection of maritime and trade routes in the West and on along the Syrio-Palestinian coast. So finding all these various hordes of coins in the Mediterranean only proves the existence of such a large-scale enterprise as being lucrative, but it does not support much in the way of the social reception of these enslaved people. So legally, the slave trade obviously was very lucrative, but it did generate a paper trail, and the inhabitants of the Black Sea were not unusually poor or unusually conflict prone or unusually or nameless or meaningless, as has commonly been assumed as to their status. They very much were just forced removal of these people from their homes into a life of enslavement. But that forced removal of these people was a task that was centered and strengthened within this social hierarchy that we've been talking about, and that social hierarchy has been listed by social terminology. All that to say, social terminology, very important. Excuse me if I sound a little bit like not ordered. Allergies are definitely a thing, and I've definitely been pausing our recording to sneeze horribly, so hopefully everything is coming across fine. But as far as the terminology is growing and developing this ethnoculture and identity of the Balkan pagans and the enslaving merchants, the Italian merchants actually started this origin of the legal word of Slav being the legal word for slave. So originally it started off, the word for slave started off with the Latin sclavus that had been utilized by that was found to be utilized by German legal systems, but then the Slav was applied by Italian merchants to these captured Slavic pagans. However, when they get to Albania and start utilizing the word Slav in the 14th century, the Statute of Shkodra, so these are just legal statutes, actually list Slav as meaning lords, and they have to amend it in Albania so that servants are amended to mean service or ankila. And these deliberate terminologies in states within and around the Byzantine Empire contribute to that ethnoculture and provide the scaffolding needed for the Byzantine identity to be observed and defined by other nations around it as they interact economically with them. So these people were, of course, sold and utilized for the specific work in and around the Mediterranean, and they were sold to the Byzantine Empire, but transported by several different types of merchants. The concern of who could be enslaved and who could not be enslaved was not really a foundational issue, but it did require some social structuring in order to receive the proper support from the church. Predominantly female slaves as well performed more domestic tasks that were essential in the local economy, and contracting work from a free female servant was more common actually than purchasing a slave. But the choice in creating a slave is by religion is essential here because it was a method by which the Byzantines chose to create their identity, who they were and who they were not, who they were religiously and who they were not religiously. The importance of this religion is seen as Catalan merchants who operated mainly in Ragusa. Modern Dubrovnik were purchasing slaves and trading for salt and fabrics. They kept moving into the hinterland, searching specifically for non-Christians so that they could enslave them and make more money from them. The church was perfectly fine with this. They stood on the position that it was perfectly lawful to enslave and forcefully capture those of a separate religion, or those who practiced idolatry, as they would then, of course, be taken to a civilized country and receive the grace of God via a forced baptism. And the increase in influence of religion also became a staple in creating this Byzantine culture. However, the definitions of what Christians were not was a little bit negated, as most of that Christian identity that was created was entirely forced. And most of these people were, of course, already impoverished in Albania after many of the Mongolian civil wars. They were just willing to sell themselves already into debt slavery. They sold themselves, they sold their families, as it was a more preferable option, especially with the lack of manpower in the 15th century due to the Black Death and the migrations forced by the invading Turks. The continuing and strengthening political tie and economic ties with wealthy Florentines provided many of these Albanians the ability to survive and sustain themselves with what little that they had, and even got to a point that was so bad that slavery was banned in Ragusa because of the massive amount of outflux of wealth generated for solely Catalan and Florentine merchants. And of course, Christian merchants just searching for wealth and power in the Balkans just found people willing to sell themselves. And these Catalans that we're making a nice little meme about are actually traced to the Catalan company of what is now modern-day Crete in the 14th century. And the Catalan company served in the Balkans, serving as a capacity to distribute slaves across the Mediterranean and then, of course, accrue wealth for Spain. Eventually, however, by way of Bishop Ramon de Esclares in Barcelona and in all of the cities of Catalonia, from the end of the 14th century, a church-backed agreement was reached that provided for the immediate release of all of the Greek and Albanian slaves, and as they, on the grounds they were existing Christians. So that hard line of Christianity being a necessity for slavery was not as hard and fast across the Mediterranean, but it was sort of a general rule that was followed. However, in Italy, there's an example of in the 15th century of a priest of Casale, Bartolomeo di Piero, who was requesting an older slave, and as he was told that they were more difficult to procure, and he promised to set the slave free if she proved to be unhappy, but he had very little qualms about the potential Christianity of this slave, rather the fact that if it was a younger woman, he did not want to be associated with a younger woman in regards to his priestly office. So Again, just moving more into different types of slavery. Please let me know if I'm moving too quickly. I have been known to speak very quickly, so I'm just attempting to keep all of my thoughts in order, as well as not perish due to the constant allergens in and around the air. But um, yes, the different types of slavery existed. These are the Mamluks. This is a nice little map of the invading Khans of the Chagatai Khanate through the Ilkhanate into the Mamluk Sultanate. But the Mamluk system of military slavery was perceived by Muslims and Christians kind of a bit all over the Mediterranean Sea as a means to win slaves' souls for either Islam and Christianity, and was widely considered a massive win. And the Jewish community in Egypt as well, regarded the integration of these slave converts as a victory for their own faith. So the Mamluk Sultanate, Egypt, was a major purchaser of many of these Balkan enslaved people. And they gained many of these integrated members from either the Byzantines directly or from Byzantine affiliated merchants, and turned them into war slaves, as Dr. Dashtendog writes right here that these war slaves were initially of Kipchak origin, were transported as children, converted to Islam, trained as elite soldiers, freed, and given posts in the army and government. And they very much played a crucial role in eliminating the powerful Hooligan Mongols in the region. As you can see here, the invading Mongols moved straight from the Chagatai Khanate through the Ilkhanate into Mamluk Sultanate, and they fight over that throughout the 13th century. But the typical Mamluk began life as a pagan in the steppe or the mountainous regions in the north and east of the Black Sea, where they was enslaved as a young boy. They captured in war or sold by his impoverished parents and introduced into a new poverty-based network of slavery. And this necessary identity recognition of that social hierarchy goes further into how slaves viewed themselves, as it's necessary to examine their potential influence and agency throughout their enslavement, as it illustrates a simultaneous creation of both the enslaved person and the free person as they interact within the same cultures, because this would very likely have been both an example of an enslaved person and an enslaved person, and seeing two very different lenses in the same particular culture. So, additionally, with this, the Italian and Mamluk merchants were also known to allow their slaves to work in craft production and trade, and act as extensions of their masters, even traveling as business agents. This extension of office varied among the Mediterranean cultures, but definitely could have allowed the same ethnic group, the Balkans, a much wider sphere of influence, even as they were still subjugated under their respective masters. There didn't necessarily end in service to a foreign lord, but this manumission with a marketable skill was a very high possibility. Manumission, of course, being an essential part of that transition from both male slaves of transference from an enslaved soldier to a free soldier, but also manumission in female slaves from a concubine, or what was known as an walad, to a wife, and marriage as well. But marriage and slavery constituted two different types of ownership of the body, with different rights in each. And these two legal states could not coexist. There wasn't such a thing as a slave wife. Um, and in Valencia, for example, there were examples of these enslaved people gaining manumission and afterwards even gaining certain gifts from their master after their manumission, or completing a certain project as a craftsman and gaining the tools necessary to continue their trade. Um, there's there the this very multi-ethnic nature of slavery as an act throughout the Mediterranean, which contributed greatly to this Balkan diaspora across the Mediterranean, but it also created a whole manumitted populace of professional and militaristic uh, professionals who would contribute to their respective new nations um, as well. And these more typical examples, working as day laborers, male slaves were also just valued by these artisans as extra assistants in the workshops. And artisans, and this is in Valencia, artisans figured in about 40% of the slave transactions. However, they shared slaves across artisans. It was a very common thing, and it's very likely that the slaves utilized by these artisans is quite a bit higher um, than what we see with just that simple 40%. So with that likely higher number than 40%, what does that have to even do with art or architecture across the Mediterranean in regards to the Byzantine artistic developments? So the one thing to pay attention to in this class is that I am attempting to demonstrate that the necessity of these religious groups to win these souls for their cause and thereby portray their religion through the artistic work of these enslaved peoples is that so we can assign the agency of these diasporic Balkan people as they influence that art with their prior existing cultures. They were the this is not to remove the multicultural aspects of the artisans already working professionally at this time. This is instead to just emphasize the existing cultures that the Balkan peoples had, and it was specifically through the religious structures that they were forced to work on that we can see this throughout the Mediterranean. And the communities that hosted wider varieties of these people as a method to define their identities would have been the same communities that were used to hold wider multicultural characteristics as representations of that social hierarchy that was at hand, and then of course manipulated to benefit that ruling elite. So as to the various communities that were contributed to the various cultures all over the Mediterranean that were not without a cultural origin or could well have possessed an established identity before this assimilation or acculturation. These many communities within the Byzantine Empire fell to their military or were brought in or were bought in, as was the case with the Golden Horde. It's just further exemplary of the wide multicultural developments of the Byzantine Empire, either deliberate or not deliberate, as they created their wider Byzantine culture. Now, for the art analysis section, we're constantly remembering the importance of the social hierarchy that's created. I should definitely have put that in the last slide as biggest possible term for today. social hierarchy, and where we find artisans, and where we find slaves, and where we find servants, all, of course, as they are relating to the emperor and the empire. So specifically, though, in in bringing in that multicultural aspect into the empire didn't solely have multiculturalism through simply just enslaved Balkan nations. They created ties with everyone that they could, and one of the major examples is, of course, the Golden Horde. Avaga, son of the Ilkhanate, of the Ilkhan, marries into the Paleologian dynasty, and of course he would have received interesting Byzantine gift artworks, but we're not solely focused on that art. We're not focused on every single type of art that was Byzantine. We're focused on the multicultural and multi-ethnic arts, as well as multicultural and multi-ethnic arts as they relate to religion. So it would have been nice to have found a Mongolian religious artistic piece that we could just throw right in here and hopefully find elsewhere throughout the Mediterranean. But as you can see through my very nice artistic meme, that we do not have one at the moment, and I'm just attempting to situate the role of the Mongols as preeminent contributors to the religious and artistic influencers of this particular area, whether or not they had that religious or artistic influence directly themselves. So we're going to go to those they influenced directly. We're starting with both Georgia and Armenia as our examples of existing religious and cultural identities, and how they were tied together through the art of the people, who would then become the source of slaves that give the Byzantine emperors all of their power and all of their sources. So here we have an example of Armenian art. This is on a church in Noravank, in Armenia in the 14th century. And right here, we're focused on the development of the language of Armenia. The Armenian language developed in the 5th century, and it is a language that contains sacred symbols. As you can see here, so if I can pull up my laser pointer, all around here are sacred symbols. But this is not a traditional Armenian style. Additionally, there's a selvage, which is what it's called, of pomegranates and fleur de lis. That's a style that is very much shared with the Islamic world, especially after the Mongol conquests. And then, of course, because this is a church, we have the Virgin right here and her son right here. But these are available signifiers of Muslim influences upon the Armenian church artwork that was found through the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. But then, of course, these people would have been displaced and likely maneuvered all across the Mediterranean. And that's a bit of what I'm calling for, to find more examples of this, and not label it solely Byzantine, but as Armenian as well. We also see further examples of these enslaved people through notable traders, like the Venetians or the Genoese, and especially in regards to the Genoese and the Mongols. The Mongols attack Kaffa, and they force the Genoese to abandon it through the military actions of Toktoa Khan. And it was because the Genoese had gotten so comfortable with the Byzantine model of just enslaving those who were not Christian. They began enslaving those subjects of the Golden Horde and other Mongols whose trade was, of course, forbidden. And because they had gotten so used to trading essentially refugees, they were not ready for the very strong military of the Mongol Khanate, who eventually kicked them out. But the people who were enslaved by these traders were transported all across the Black Sea, sometimes willingly, to notable places of industry and craftsmanship. And their market was created by the Byzantines in power in order to gain these allegiances and political strength. But of course, it came at the cost of a massive diaspora in the communities closest to them. Um, and we're looking here, of course, at cultural centers. Wonderful quote by Katerina Radku about the analysis of the economic centrality as it utilizes the central place theory and the relating concept of centrality as a site which offers one or more services for the people living around it, such as higher order centers and lower order centers, which provide either specialized functions for the higher order centers, like healthcare, public transportation, or basic functions, like a market, religious institutions, etc. But these Balkan enslaved populace, they had existing culture from which they draw their work and from which we have seen them implement this work in both high order centers and low order centers. And that's what we had seen previously, as there's a massive multicultural growth and influence in all of the towns and cities in which these enslaved people were forced to work, as they, of course, were central hubs of culture and influence. These enslaved people were still people, and they had existing cultures and established art forms that should be recognized as influencing to all of the cultures and communities in which they lived and worked within. So, as far as cultures that they lived and worked within, and multiculturalism a bit, it gets a little bit weirder the further west you go. This is an example that our own UNM, Dr. Justine Andrews, actually did work on. Of course, I used the worst picture that she had, so I feel a little bit bad about that. But this is at the Church of St. George Exarinos, and of course, unfortunately, this picture is covered by layers of soot. But she was able to analyze that the fresco style here is not Byzantine. It's actually closer to Assyrio-Palestinian style. So, backing up real quick a bit, this is an Armenian church. There was an Armenian populace in Famagusta, Cyprus, as it had just been overtaken by the Genoese in the 13th century. And this is actually a church that was patronized by the Genoese. So the Genoese were patronizing a Armenian church and attempting, and Andrews, of course, is attempting to show a direct link between the architecture between the Genoese and the Armenians, but it only really shows that the Genoese patronized their individual establishment. But all of this to say that we're sometimes searching for something that is not physically present, even though we know about the presence of these various communities in these various religions, that is necessary in creating a historical narrative about the lived experiences of all the people that live across this social hierarchy. This culmination of cultures coming together and a singular artistic form within the Byzantine Empire is mainly found within the art and architecture of churches, predominantly. And of course, right here, the Church of St. George Exarinos. Um, there is a culminatory church as well that we're about to see, that, of course, was analyzed by Anthony Eastman, and several other churches that have been analyzed, or they were Orthodox churches in Greece, smaller scale, analyzed by Sharon E.J. Gersel. So arts in these churches are what are primarily multicultural, and of course this is a picture of the Hagia Sophia that I got from the very helpful internet. Um, but the most immediate context for the church of the Hagia Sophia is the Mongol invasion of Anatolia, which of course alters the social and political structures in Anatolia, and the Caucasus created a power vacuum in Georgia and situated Trebizond as intermediary between the East and the West. Excuse me, I'm very sorry about that. But this arts being multicultural is what we're working with, and as it is the culmination of all of these peoples living and working together, this shift is important as it's just an immense cultural change that needed the immediate address of the empire, as this constant culture of importance and reverence of the empire is key in maintaining the Byzantines' constant outward political facade. And of course, that being their primary political barrier, as they have all of these encroaching enemies around them. But the variety of people gaining work in these freshly relocated empire is just interesting enough to view. But we do shed light on what the developments were happening after the move of the empire at the end of the 14th century, and what the attitudes of Christians were at the end of the 14th century, as of course who could work in these churches. So who could work in these churches toward the end of the 14th century? This is one of the churches that Sharon Christel researched. She found evidence of 3 men who had been buried in the narthex of the Transfiguration Church at Behnken in Greece, and all of them had signs of prolonged stress on their skeletons that displayed not a higher stature, but definitely one more consistent with a common laborer. And this is helpful because it shows the existence of laborers known to exist within the church. Now, would a slave have likely been utilized or been buried in the narthex of a church? Probably not. There's not much of a reason for that, but a laborer, somebody who just worked or was a primary parishioner of that church, very well could be, especially as we have seen the various ways that one could be manumitted in and around the Mediterranean as they were slaves within this similar empire. So, but we are also interested as to who could work in these churches, as there are other representations of male sinners in the masonry icon screen in the next slide, which is the mid-13th century Church of St. George in Attica, also in Greece, that shows the division of those who labored and those who benefited from their labor. And of course, we're right back to that social hierarchy thing that I've been talking about this whole time. Social hierarchy is very important. Right here, as we can see, we have our friend. This is our laborer. This is our foolish looking laborer, and our great professional artist, who would have, of course, been a professional, is definitely looking down on laborers and those unfortunate folks who commit the sins of laborers, such as I believe it's mainly negligence that we see here. And there's a clear social hierarchy between the artisans, priests, and servants, as well as slaves. And if we know that there were existing slave laborers in and around the church social hierarchy, a professional artisan might have taken umbrage with their existence. And of course, it would make sense as to why the apparent gladness that the artist is seeming to take with the suffering of these male laborers within this scene. There's a little bit of there's another extension of this scene where they're specifically being tortured, but leads the viewer to believe that the slave laborer or the laborer was likely not involved with the creation of this art piece, but could have very well been involved elsewhere. And of course, drawing the artist to depict that male laborer as foolish and punishable. And religions in the Balkans. We're going back. This is a quick refresh into what we've previously looked at in the 11th century with the first split of Christianity. Evidences of Georgian Orthodox Church have been found in the mid 13th century. That's what we've been talking about. And we need to go back to remember our examples of Latin Christendom and Eastern Orthodox Christendom in the 11th century. So, of course, we have our Western Empire over here that would be developing Roman Catholic. And this is, of course, where we do not see much elements of that Byzantine Christian influence, or we have not yet found that influence. But throughout the Eastern Orthodox, we have. And then, of course, more nice memes. But Georgia, as situated in the Black Sea, across the Black Sea, this is, of course, a nice 13th century kingdom of Georgia that shows where they were. If they were Eastern Orthodox, where would they have been placed? And we have nice comparisons back to the Byzantine here. There goes my phone. Sorry about that. The Hagia Sophia plaque roundels right here look very similar to the Georgian carved roundels at Tecumseh, which is a site in Georgia in the mid 13th century. We're just going to start rushing through most of these, but there does seem to be some sort of lenience in creating this architectural framework for these churches in a manner that would both suit the desired outcome and possess the elements of original training of that laborer. So if the laborer originally trained here in Georgia in the mid-13th century practicing roundels, when they would have been hired by Manuel I over in Trebizond and working on the Hagia Sophia, we can see evidence, very, very similar evidence of these plaque roundels working here. Very similar with the Armenians as well. Armenian carved roundel right down here. The Kashgar outside the Church of the Mother of God at Hagatzin in the 13th century, and then of course the floral plaque, the west side of the south portion, the Hagia Sophia, figure 7. So you can see very similar. We have a very similar floral roundel right down here with the cross on top, and then here at the Hagia Sophia we have an extended version right here with hints of a cross right up here, and it makes sense. This being in the 13th century and then analyzing where they would have gone in the 14th century, these would have been the people who would have been conquered by the Mongols in their invasions and civil wars. These are the people who would have been enslaved uh, by the Byzantines and the Byzantine affiliated traders. And it's important for us um, as historians to make this distinction between art and architecture, as it becomes this liminal space that does hold agency for those of enslavement, and is an important distinction to make, as it allows us further research into the world that we study, and provides the marginalized groups the space that they had in the societies in which they lived. And that is it.